On the 24th of June, 1717, four groups of men arrived at a tavern in St. Paul's Churchyard, London, a place called the Goose and Gridiron, and did something that, on its face, could not have looked less significant. They voted. They chose a leader, a gentleman of modest means named Anthony Sayer, and they called their new arrangement the Grand Lodge of Freemasons. No royal decree authorized it, no newspaper reported it, no founding charter was signed that day, and no independent contemporary account of the meeting has ever surfaced. The only detailed description of what happened would not be written for another 21 years by a Scottish Presbyterian minister who had his own reasons to make the founding sound dignified and ancient. The men at the Goose and Gridiron were, by every visible measure, nobody, representatives of four unremarkable clubs that met above alehouses and taverns and admitted that their order had something to do, at least in legend, with the builders of Solomon's temple. Within a decade, the Duke of Montague would kneel before them and beg to be initiated. Within 2 decades, the most brilliant minds of the Enlightenment would follow. Within a century, the symbols of their fraternity would appear on the currency of a new republic, on the cornerstones of its greatest monuments, in the operas of Mozart and the correspondence of Voltaire, and the quiet notebooks of men who were quietly redesigning the world. The Freemasons. 3 centuries old, and still hiding in plain sight. But the story that surrounds them is not the one most people know. It is stranger, in some ways darker, and in others considerably more human than the conspiracy theories suggest. And the conspiracy theories are almost entirely wrong. There is one documented fact that anchors everything that follows. The reverse of the Great Seal of the United States, the pyramid, the unfinished eye, the Latin motto, was designed in 1782 by men with no documented Masonic connection whatsoever. It sat in a drawer for 150 years, barely used. It appeared on the American dollar bill in 1935, when a Freemason president and his Freemason Secretary of Agriculture placed it there because they admired how it looked, because the phrase, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages, a quote from Virgil about the birth of a new generation, seemed to fit the spirit of the New Deal. 2 men, acting in broad daylight, authorized the printing of hundreds of millions of banknotes carrying what would become the most famous, supposed proof of secret Masonic world domination. It was not a secret. It was a design choice. Nobody noticed for decades. That is the Freemasons. That is the shape of the whole story. An order so visible, it hid in the open. So influential, it generated centuries of enemies, and so deeply misunderstood that the truth, when you finally find it, turns out to be more interesting than the lie. To understand what assembled at the Goose and Gridiron in 1717, you have to go back much further. Not to Solomon's temple, which is legend, not to ancient Egypt, which is fantasy, but to the muddy building sites of medieval Britain, where men who cut and set stone for a living developed something that would outlast every cathedral they built. The medieval operative mason was a skilled tradesman in an era before professional licensing, before any reliable way to verify that a man presenting himself at a new construction site as a master mason had actually earned that rank. Across the great building projects of Britain and Europe, the cathedrals at Salisbury and York, the royal castles of Edward I, the abbeys that stitched the landscape of Scotland together, stone by stone, workers moved from site to site as projects began and ended, following the work wherever it led. The lodges, temporary wooden structures erected at the base of a building under construction, became something more than a place to store tools. They became the place where identity was established, where qualifications were tested, where the symbols of the trade, the signs, the passwords, the handshakes that identified a qualified craftsman to a foreman who had never met him before, were taught, guarded, and passed on. The oldest surviving document in the Masonic tradition is a manuscript dating to roughly 1390 to 1410, held today in the British Museum, the Regius manuscript, a poem in Middle English setting out what Masons called the old charges, the regulations of the craft. It is genuinely medieval. It was not invented by later romanticists or forged by later apologists. The men who preserved those charges also preserved a mythology, a claim that their trade descended from the builders of Solomon's temple, from the geometry of Euclid, from the philosophy of Pythagoras. And this mythology was never meant to be literal history. It was the guild's way of saying, what we do is ancient, and what we know is sacred, and what you will learn here has been worth protecting for longer than any of us can measure. Scotland is where the story gets specific. In 1598 and 1599, a man named William Shaw, the Master of Works to King James VI of Scotland, the man responsible for all royal building, issued two sets of statutes that formalized the governance of Scottish stoneworking lodges. The Shaw statutes required lodges to keep records, to test the qualifications of their members, and to maintain the craft's traditions with a kind of institutional seriousness that had not existed before. They are the first official quasi-governmental Masonic documents in history, and they prove something important. Organized, regulated masonry existed in Scotland before 1717 by more than a century. The Lodge of Edinburgh, known as Mary's Chapel No. 1, has unbroken documented records from 1599. It is the oldest lodge in the world that can prove its own continuous existence. What happened next is the pivot that changes everything. Sometime in the early decades of the 17th century, English and Scottish lodges began admitting men who had nothing to do with the building trade. Gentlemen, scholars, aristocrats, lawyers, men of learning and social standing who wanted what the lodges offered and had never lifted a chisel in their lives. The reasons for this are still debated by historians who study nothing else. Perhaps the lodges offered a neutral social space in an England torn apart by civil war and religious conflict, a place where a man's politics and denomination would not disqualify him from sitting alongside his neighbor. Perhaps the philosophical content of the old charges, the geometry, the allusions to ancient wisdom, the mythology of Solomon's temple, appealed to men shaped by the Renaissance's obsession with recovering lost knowledge from antiquity. Perhaps the lodges simply needed the money and connections that wealthy patrons could provide, and the patrons needed the privacy and fraternity that the lodges could offer. The earliest documented case belongs to a man named Elias Ashmole. Born in 1617, Ashmole would go on to found the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, one of the first public museums in the world, and to spend his life collecting and preserving the manuscripts of English antiquity. He was not a stonemason. He was never a stonemason. But on the 16th of October, 1646, Ashmole wrote in his diary, a manuscript that rests today in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, that he had been made a Freemason at a lodge meeting held at his father-in-law's house in Warrington, Cheshire. The entry is brief. It does not explain why. It does not describe the ceremony. It names the other men present, records the date, and moves on, and Ashmole does not attend another lodge meeting for 36 years. That gap is a small mystery that opens a larger one. A man is admitted to a fraternity and then apparently does nothing with the membership for nearly 4 decades. And yet when he finally attends again in 1682, he goes to a lodge in London and is received as a brother in good standing. What does this tell us about what the early lodges actually were? Were they so loosely organized that a decades-long absence was unremarkable? Were they primarily concerned with the initiation itself, the conferring of something, rather than with regular attendance and practice? The record does not say. We know the date, we know the place. The reason stays hidden. A few years before Ashmole's initiation, another name appears in the records. Robert Moray, scientist, courtier, and later a founding fellow of the Royal Society of London, was admitted to the Lodge of Edinburgh while the lodge was operating in the field with a Scottish army regiment near Newcastle in 1641. Moray's is the earliest recorded admission of a Freemason on English soil. He was not English, the lodge was Scottish, but the point stands. By the early 1640s, the lodges were already traveling across borders and already admitting men who had no connection to the working trade. By 1717, this process had been underway for the better part of a century. The 4 lodges that met at the Goose and Gridiron were not stonemasons' guilds. They were social clubs for gentlemen, professionals, and tradesmen who had inherited a structure, the lodge, the degrees, the charges, the ceremonial grips and passwords, from an older working tradition, and were doing something new with it, something that had not yet been fully defined. They were men who had been meeting above taverns in London for purposes that blurred the line between fellowship and philosophy, between the sociable and the symbolic, and who had decided on St. John the Baptist's Day that they wanted a central organization. The choice of that date was deliberate. The feast of St. John the Baptist, the patron saint of operative stonemasons in the medieval Catholic tradition, linked the new secular fraternity to the ancient craft. It was the oldest trick available to any new institution. Dress the new thing in the clothes of something ancient, and half your audience will accept the genealogy without asking for the birth certificate. Anthony Sayer was elected Grand Master. He was a gentleman of limited financial means who would, in the years after his Grand Mastership, fall into poverty significant enough that the fraternity he had led would record charity payments made to him. The man who held what conspiracy theorists would later call the most powerful secret position in the Western world ended his life receiving alms from his own lodge. That detail is not a footnote. It is the whole argument in miniature. Within 4 years, something remarkable had happened anyway. In 1721, the Duke of Montague requested initiation, and the Grand Lodge suddenly had a patron of a very different social weight. An English duke, a peer of the realm, a man who moved in the circles of kings, kneeling before the square and compass in a room above a London street. When Montague was elected Grand Master that year, the fraternity's social complexion changed overnight. If a duke could be made on the level with a tradesman, the lodge's promise of equality across class was no longer merely theoretical. It was attractive. It was fashionable, and fashion in 18th century England was one of the most powerful forces in the universe. James Anderson was handed his commission, the task of writing the new Grand Lodge's governing document, and the result, published in 1723 under the title Constitutions of the Freemasons, was a document whose most important sentence occupied barely a clause. Masons, Anderson wrote, were required to hold that religion in which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves. No creed required, no confession, no catechism. A Protestant and a Catholic and a deist could sit in the same lodge beside men of every other conviction, united by the shared commitments of the craft, rather than divided by the theological wars that had soaked England in blood within living memory. In 1723, this was a genuinely radical proposition, and it was not accidental. Anderson's non-sectarian clause was not a loophole, it was the entire point. The constitutions also gave the fraternity a history, a mythological lineage running from Adam through Solomon and Hiram and the builders of the temple, through Euclid and Pythagoras and the great medieval cathedral builders, down to the present. And none of this was meant as literal genealogy, and Anderson knew it. What it was meant to be was a way of situating the new institution within the oldest human activities: building, measuring, mathematics, the ordering of space. It was a claim of dignity, not a claim of fact. By the time the constitutions were revised in their 1738 edition, Masonry had spread to France, the Dutch Republic, and the American colonies. That 1738 edition also contained, almost incidentally, the only detailed account that exists of the 1717 founding, written 21 years after the fact, by a man with every institutional reason to make the event seem grander than it may have been. The history of Freemasonry begins, as it continues, with a document that is entirely reliable as a record of what the fraternity wished to be, and only partly reliable as a record of what actually happened. That tension between the order's mythology and its documented history, between what it claimed to be and what it demonstrably was, would prove to be the engine of 300 years of controversy, persecution, fabrication, and misunderstanding. But before any of that could happen, there was a ceremony to perform. There was a candidate waiting, There was a blindfold to be tied. The candidate stands in a preparation room, stripped of his jacket and his waistcoat, his left knee and breast bared, his left shoe replaced by a slipper. One eye is covered. A noose, called a cable tow, hangs loosely around his neck. He cannot see what he is walking into. He cannot see the men assembled in the room beyond the door. He cannot see the altar at the center of the lodge on which rests an open Bible, or the Torah, or the Quran, or whatever volume of sacred law belongs to the faith of the man about to enter. All he has been told is that he is about to travel from darkness to light. This is the first degree. This is how it has been done in all essential elements since at least 1730, when a man named Samuel Pritchard published an expose of Masonic ritual that Masonic historians generally consider accurate and which revealed the ceremony in enough detail that no subsequent secret could survive intact. The ritual has been published, analyzed, described, and debated in public for nearly 300 years. The secrets of Freemasonry are at this point the most extensively documented secrets in Western history. That fact matters. It is the first thing the popular story always gets wrong. The 3 degrees of what Masons call the craft. Entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master Mason constitute the universal foundation of Freemasonry worldwide. Every Masonic body that claims regular lineage traces its authority through these 3 degrees. Everything that follows them, the Scottish Rite with its further 29 degrees, the York Rite's chapters and commanderies, the Shriners in their red fezes raising money for children's hospitals, is a pendant to these 3, built on top of them and requires them as a prerequisite. The first degree entered apprentice is the initiation. The blindfolded candidate, hoodwinked in Masonic vocabulary, a word that entered the English language from this ceremony, is led around the lodge, presented to the officers at each of its cardinal points, asked to affirm his belief in a supreme being, and required to take an obligation on the sacred text of his own faith. The penalty clause attached to that obligation, in the historical formulation, language about having his throat cut from ear to ear should he betray the secrets of the degree, is real. It appears in Pritchard's 1730 account. It appears in William Morgan's 1826 expose. It is not a fabrication of conspiracy theorists, but it is also, and has always been, explicitly symbolic, a rhetorical inheritance from the guild tradition of medieval craft oaths, not a literal prescription for execution. In 1986, the United Grand Lodge of England formally ruled that these clauses could be omitted from the obligation. Many lodges have done so. The obligation remains. The graphic imagery is optional. At the conclusion of the first degree, the blindfold is removed. The candidate sees the lodge for the first time, and what is meant to register in that moment, the transition from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge, is the ceremony's central metaphor. It is not subtle. It was never meant to be. The second degree, fellow craft, carries the candidate deeper into the symbolic language of the operative trade. He receives instruction in the 7 liberal arts and sciences: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, and is led in symbolic procession through what the ritual calls the middle chamber of Solomon's temple, ascending a staircase of 3, 5, and 7 steps, representing the increasingly complex forms of human knowledge. The working tools of this degree are the square and the compasses. Now, with a different arrangement of the points, one revealed in the first degree, a second in the second, and the overall movement is from the simple moral instruction of the first degree toward a broader philosophical landscape. But it is the third degree where everything changes. The Master Mason degree is the climax of craft masonry, and at its center is a story, a legend, that has no basis in the biblical texts it borrows from and no historical verification of any kind, and which has nonetheless been the heart of Masonic initiation for nearly 3 centuries. It is the legend of Hiram Abiff. The Bible does mention Hiram of Tyre. In the first book of Kings and in the second book of Chronicles, he is described as a skilled craftsman sent by the Phoenician king to work bronze for Solomon's temple, a man of great skill with metals. That is all the Bible says. What Masonry did with Hiram is something else entirely. In the Masonic legend, Hiram Abiff is the chief architect of the entire temple, the possessor of the Master's Word, a secret password of supreme significance, and the target of 3 fellow craft masons who want that word before they have earned it. The 3 men, each stationed at a different gate of the temple, confront Hiram in succession and demand the word. Hiram refuses each one. He is struck down. He dies without surrendering what he knows. His body is concealed, then discovered, marked only by an acacia branch placed over the burial site. When King Solomon and the king of Tyre learn what has happened, they determine that the true Master's Word is lost forever, and a substitute word must be adopted. This is the drama enacted in the 3rd degree initiation. The candidate plays Hiram. He is laid on the floor of the lodge, covered with a shroud, and then raised from that symbolic grave by the grip that Master Masons call the lion's paw. The strong grip that the ritual insists could raise even the dead, which is to say, the grip that raises a new Master Mason into the full knowledge of the degree. He dies. He is raised. He learns what has been recovered and what has been permanently lost. That tension between loss and recovery, the original something that cannot be fully restored, the substitute that must stand in its place, is the philosophical core of the whole Masonic system. It is not, whatever the critics have said, a satanic ceremony. It is a meditation on human mortality and the impermanence of knowledge, clothed in the architectural metaphor of an ancient building that was destroyed long before any of its builders could finish what they started. The stone is always still being cut. The temple is always still unfinished. And the symbols that surround this legend are everywhere. The square and compasses, the most universally recognized Masonic emblem, carry meanings that the fraternity states openly in its published material. The square represents moral rectitude, acting on the square, a phrase that entered everyday English from this symbol. The compasses represent the bounding of desires, the discipline of keeping within due limits. Together they signify something like, measure your conduct with the precision you would give to stonework, and you will build something that lasts. The letter G that often appears between them officially stands for both geometry, the mathematical foundation of the operative craft, and for God, here called the Grand Architect of the Universe, a deliberately non-sectarian title that allows a deist, a Christian, a Jew, or a Muslim to recognize the same divine principle under different names without anyone being asked to compromise their own theology. The white lambskin apron that every Mason receives at his initiation is, per the fraternity's own teaching, more ancient than the golden fleece or the Roman eagle, a claim that is, of course, mythological, but which gestures toward the apron's real lineage in the functional leather work apron of the operative stonecutter. The level symbolizes equality, all men meeting on the same plane, regardless of the rank they hold outside the lodge. The plumb line symbolizes upright conduct. The trowel, which spreads mortar between stones, symbolizes the spreading of brotherly love. The acacia branch marks immortality, the place where Hiram was buried, the thing that survived. These meanings are not hidden. They appear in every introductory Masonic publication. They have been stated publicly since Anderson's 1723 Constitutions. The secrecy surrounding Freemasonry has never been primarily about its meanings. It has been about its modes of recognition, the grips, the passwords, the signs specific to each degree, which allow a Mason traveling to a lodge in a city he has never visited to prove his membership to men who have never met him. These recognition tokens are what the obligations protect, and they are what every expose since 1730 has published in full detail. The secrets of Freemasonry are, and have been for nearly 3 centuries, among the most publicly available information in the English-speaking world. What the lodge kept genuinely private was something different and, in its own way, more significant: the names of its members, the location of its meetings, the internal affairs of a fraternity that had discovered, by painful experience, that the wrong disclosure at the wrong moment could get a man killed, or at least fired, blacklisted, or excommunicated. The question of who was not welcome in this supposedly universal brotherhood matters as much as the question of who was. Prince Hall was born around 1735 in circumstances that are themselves disputed. Some accounts say Boston, others say Barbados, and the historical record is unclear enough that neither can be stated as definitive. What is certain is that by the 1770s, he was a free black man living in Boston, a community leader, a man of standing in a city where the standing of free black men was constantly contested. On the 6th of March, 1775, Hall and 14 other free African-American men were initiated into Irish Military Lodge No. 441, attached to a British Army regiment stationed near Boston by a visiting Masonic officer. The lodge's records document the admissions. Hall applied to the English Grand Lodge for a charter. He waited 12 years. In 1787, the charter for African Lodge No. 459 finally arrived from London, a legitimate Masonic charter from the recognized governing body of World Masonry, authorizing Hall and his brothers to operate a fully regular lodge. American white Grand Lodges refused to recognize it. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, Prince Hall Masonic lodges were labeled clandestine, a technical Masonic term for unrecognized organizations, by the very Grand Lodges whose parent body had issued Hall's charter. The fraternity that proclaimed on the level, that insisted no man's rank outside the lodge, affected his standing inside it, enforced racial exclusion for 150 years with the language and machinery of institutional Masonry itself. The word brotherhood was in the ritual. The practice was something else. It was not until the 1990s and 2000s that the majority of American state Grand Lodges formally extended mutual recognition to Prince Hall Grand Lodges, a process completed in most jurisdictions only within the living memory of men still active in lodges today. Prince Hall Masonry now has an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 members in the United States. It exists because a free black man in colonial Boston sought admission to a fraternity that claimed to admit all men on the level, was admitted by British soldiers, and then spent the rest of his life building an institution because the white American lodges would not acknowledge what England had already granted. Hall died in 1807. The recognition came long after. The fraternity's 3 degrees were not the only structure available to the ambitious Mason, nor even, by the 19th century, the most socially prominent. Above the 3 craft degrees lay a vast architecture of what Masonry calls appendant bodies, organizations that require Master Mason membership as their prerequisite, and then offer further elaboration of the symbolic system, further degrees, further ceremonies, and further networks. The York Rite extended the craft degrees into a Royal Arch chapter, widely considered in English Masonry, to complete the Master Mason degree by recovering the lost master's word that Hiram took to his grave. It also offered a council of royal and select masters, practicing what is called cryptic masonry, degrees dealing with the concealed vault beneath Solomon's temple, and a commandery of Knights Templar, clothing the system in the armor of the medieval crusading orders and tracing, in legend only, a line of descent from the warrior monks dissolved by Pope Clement VII in 1312. The Scottish Rite offered 29 additional degrees beyond Master Mason, numbered from the 4th to the 32nd, conferred in a series of bodies called Lodges of Perfection, Chapters of Rose Croix, Councils of Kadosh, and Consistories. The 33rd degree was honorary, conferred for distinguished service. The southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite in the United States made its home in the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C., a monumental neoclassical building completed in 1915, designed by the same architect who would later design the Jefferson Memorial, open today to the public for tours, housing in its interior the remains of the man who was for 32 years the most influential figure in American Scottish Rite Masonry, and who became, in the century after his death, the most lied about man in the history of the fraternity. His name was Albert Pike, and almost everything the popular story says about him is false. But before Pike, and before the hoax that made him infamous, the fraternity had a century of remarkable growth to accomplish, an enlightenment to help midwife, a revolution or two to quietly attend, and a murder to commit, or at least to very nearly get away with. George Washington was raised a Master Mason at Fredericksburg Lodge No. 4 in Virginia on the 4th of August, 1752. He was in his early 20s. The country he would one day lead did not yet exist. The war that would make him famous was more than 2 decades away. He was a young Virginia planter with a surveyor's training and a gift for deliberate, careful action. And the lodge, with its emphasis on geometry as a moral language and its insistence that all men meet on the level regardless of rank, fit something in him that his Episcopalian vestrymanship and his militia commission did not quite fill. He was not a deeply active Mason in the years that followed. He did not seek high office within the fraternity. He was not, despite what popular mythology sometimes asserts, the Grand Master of all American Masonry. He held no such position. What he was, consistently and throughout his life, was a committed member of his local lodge, a man who wore the apron and accepted the obligations and appeared when the ceremonies required him. And when the cornerstone of the United States Capitol was laid on the 18th of September, 1793, George Washington appeared in his Masonic apron, presided over the corn, wine, and oil ceremony that operative Masons had performed at the beginning of every major building since the medieval guilds, and offered up the new republic's most important building as a Masonic cornerstone in front of a crowd that recorded the event in the local press and thought nothing remarkable about it. It was not hidden, it was celebrated. The Alexandria Gazette reported it. Washington's apron is preserved today at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia, a 333-foot tower containing a museum and lodge rooms and the tools that Washington himself used, open to any visitor who cares to look. This is what Masonic influence on the American founding actually looks like. Not a hidden hand directing events from behind a curtain, but a network of men who knew each other through their lodges, who trusted each other with shared obligations, who laid the cornerstones of the new republic's buildings with the same ceremony their grandfathers had used to lay the cornerstones of English churches, and who did all of this in full public view, in the newspapers, with speeches, in front of crowds who came to watch. Benjamin Franklin joined St. John's Lodge No. 1 in Philadelphia in 1731, and by 1734, at an age still shy of 30, he was elected Grand Master of Pennsylvania, the same year he published the first American edition of Anderson's Constitutions, adding his own preface. His Masonic membership was never a secret in his lifetime. It was part of his public identity. When he went to France as the American colony's ambassador, he brought his lodge membership with him as a credential, a social passport into the intellectual networks that would shape the French Enlightenment. And those networks gave him the French alliance that won the Revolutionary War. In Paris, Franklin became a member of the Lodge of Nine Sisters. Les Neuf Sœurs, one of the most extraordinary institutions in 18th century Europe. The Lodge of Nine Sisters was not primarily a stoneworking club with philosophical overtones. It was the Enlightenment itself, organized into lodge format. Its members included the astronomer Jérôme Lalande, the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, the revolutionary Danton, and the physician Joseph-Ignace Guillotin, a man whose contribution to the revolution was, in its own way, a monument to the Enlightenment's faith in rational, humane progress, however the subsequent century chose to remember it. The lodge brought together the men who were writing the encyclopedias, mapping the stars, redesigning the legal codes, and imagining a world organized around reason rather than inherited authority. and on the 7th of April 1778, Benjamin Franklin sponsored the initiation of Voltaire. François-Marie Arouet, who had spent 60 years writing under the name Voltaire and who had dedicated most of those years to the systematic demolition of superstition and religious tyranny, was by 1778 an old man, somewhere past 80, and was too frail to stand through a full ceremony. The lodge accommodated him. The ritual was modified. Franklin stood beside him. The two greatest living symbols of the European Enlightenment, the American sage who had translated Newton for the general reader and the French philosopher who had made wit into a weapon against the church, joined hands in a Masonic ceremony in Paris, 6 weeks before Voltaire died. Whatever else one says about Freemasonry, that image is real. It is documented in lodge records. It happened. Across the continent, in Vienna, a young composer named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was doing something that would last considerably longer than any of the political arrangements that his fellow Masons were helping to negotiate. Mozart was initiated into a lodge called Zur Wohltätigkeit, Beneficence, on the 14th of December, 1784, and he took to the fraternity with an enthusiasm that went well beyond social obligation. His Masonic compositions include the Maurerische Trauermusik, Masonic funeral music, K477, composed in 1785, for the memorial of two fellow lodge members, a piece of astonishing harmonic darkness for an occasion that most composers would have treated as a formal duty. He treated it as an opportunity, but it is his final opera. Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute, first performed in Vienna in September 1791, that stands as the most elaborate and most lasting Masonic artwork ever produced. The magic flute is openly, structurally, unavoidably Masonic. The mysterious brotherhood ruled by Sarastro, the trials of fire and water through which the hero Tamino must pass to prove himself worthy, the progression from darkness and ignorance to light and wisdom, the three chords, solemn, spaced, deliberate, that open the opera's overture, and that constitute a Masonic signal of assembly. All of this is drawn directly and knowingly from the ritual and symbolic language of the lodge. Scholars of Mozart and scholars of Masonry have been in agreement on this point since Jacques Chélé published his exhaustive analysis in 1972. The magic flute is not secretly Masonic, it is openly Masonic. Mozart composed it with the intention that those who knew would recognize it, and those who did not know would still find it beautiful, and both would be changed by what they heard. Mozart died in December 1791, 18 days after the premiere of the small cantata that was his last completed work, a piece written explicitly for lodge performance, his final gift to the fraternity. He was 35 years old. The Masonic network at its peak in the late 18th century was not a conspiracy, but it was a network. And the distinction, while real, is easy to blur in practice. Men who shared obligations across class and national lines, who trusted each other with the passwords of their degrees, and who felt a claim on their loyalty to any brother in distress, developed a texture of mutual assistance that worked precisely because it was not formal, not documented, not the kind of thing that left a paper trail that a rival could subpoena. A Mason in New York who needed a letter of introduction to a merchant in Philadelphia could get one through the lodge. A Mason seeking a position in the colonial government could expect a more sympathetic hearing from a brother Mason than from a stranger. A Mason facing financial ruin could request assistance from the lodge fund without the humiliation that public charity implied. This is what historians mean when they say that Masonic patronage networks were real. Not that Masons secretly directed governments from hidden chambers, but that the bonds of fraternal obligation functioned as social capital in an era when social capital was one of the most important resources a man could possess, and when the Masonic Lodge was one of the few institutions that allowed that capital to accumulate across the lines of class and religion that otherwise divided society. At certain moments in American history, that accumulation reached concentration significant enough to become politically visible. By 1825, A majority of the members of the New York State Legislature were Freemasons. The governor was a Mason. The judges, the sheriffs, the militia officers. Masonry had threaded itself through the public life of the state with a thoroughness that looked, from the outside, like the operation of a coordinated plan. It was not a coordinated plan. It was the natural result of what happens when a fraternal network with genuine social utility operates for several generations in a society where personal connection still determines most outcomes. But in September 1826, the appearance of coordination became something darker. William Morgan was a man in his early 50s, a former soldier, a sometime brewer, a restless and frequently unsuccessful figure who had settled in Western New York and claimed membership in the Masonic fraternity at the fellow craft or master mason level, though the exact degree he had achieved was disputed even at the time. Morgan had announced his intention to publish a complete account of Masonic ritual, every password, every grip, every ceremony of the first 3 degrees and the Royal Arch, and the Masonic establishment of Western New York had reacted with a severity that illuminated exactly how much the fraternity believed its secrets were still worth protecting. They had him arrested on spurious charges. They attempted to burn down the print shop where his book was being produced. They filed legal harassment against him through every channel available to men who happened to control most of the channels. None of it stopped the publication. On the night of September 11th and into the early morning of September 12th, 1826, Morgan was taken from the county jail in Canandaigua, New York, by a group of men, later identified as Freemasons, placed in a carriage and driven north toward the Canadian border. He was never seen again. A body was found in Lake Ontario the following October, near Niagara. The Masons said it was a Canadian. The anti-Masons said it was Morgan. The legal proceedings that followed produced 3 trials, multiple convictions, and sentences that amounted, given the gravity of what the evidence suggested, to almost nothing. Weeks in jail. Months. The men who had organized the abduction of a citizen in the night faced the equivalent of a misdemeanor. The perception that spread through New York State, through New England, through the American press was not wrong. Masonic influence in the courts and the legislature had blunted the response to what appeared to be a murder. Whether it was coordinated, whether someone had issued an order, or whether a network of men sharing an obligation had simply, without explicit instruction, found reasons to look the other way, was precisely the question that could never be satisfactorily answered, because that is always the question that networks built on personal trust make unanswerable. Morgan's promised book, Illustrations of Masonry, was published by his collaborators after his disappearance and remains in print today. It contains the ritual for the first 3 degrees and the Royal Arch, and Masonic historians who have examined it consider it broadly accurate. William Morgan died, probably most likely, though never officially, to protect information that had been publicly available since 1730, when Pritchard published it, and which anyone with access to a decent library could have read for $1. He was almost certainly killed for a secret that wasn't one. The political consequences were immediate and lasting. The Anti-Masonic Party, formed in 1828 in direct response to the Morgan affair and the subsequent perception that Masons had corrupted the justice system, became the first organized third party in American history. It held the first national political nominating convention ever conducted in the United States, a procedural innovation that American democracy still uses today. It issued the first written party platform in U.S. history. It ran William Wirt for president in 1832 and won the 7 electoral votes of Vermont. It published newspapers, organized rallies, and sustained a genuine national political movement for nearly a decade, built on the conviction that a fraternal network had become powerful enough to subvert the institutions of Republican government. The Anti-Masonic Party was not wrong that Masonic networks had operated in ways that compromised public accountability in Western New York. The historical record supports that conclusion. What the party could not prove, and what its more extreme theorists asserted anyway, was that this local failure of accountability was evidence of a national conspiracy, a hidden government, a secret sovereign operating beneath the visible one. The distance between those two claims is the distance between documented history and conspiracy theory. It was difficult to hold in 1828. It remains difficult today. The Catholic Church had been watching all of this with alarm for considerably longer than any American political party. Pope Clement XIX issued In Eminenti in 1738, the first formal papal condemnation of Freemasonry, barely 21 years after the founding at the Goose and Gridiron, which suggests that the Church had been paying closer attention than the fraternity's modest origins might have warranted. The condemnation cited several concerns: the fact that Masonic lodges admitted men of all religions indiscriminately, the fact that their proceedings were conducted in secret, the fact that members took oaths of a kind that the Church considered impermissible, and the more general concern that an institution specifically designed to be religiously neutral was, in effect, an institution designed to be independent of Rome. Pope Benedict XIV confirmed the condemnation in 1751. The machinery of papal authority was being trained on a fraternity that still met above taverns and admitted men of modest means who were curious about geometry. What the Church understood, with a clarity that the fraternity's English founders had perhaps not fully considered, was that the non-sectarian clause in Anderson's constitutions was not a minor procedural accommodation. It was a philosophical position. A lodge where a Catholic and a Protestant and a Jew and a deist could all sit together without resolving their theological differences was a lodge that had decided, implicitly but definitively, that theological differences did not need to be resolved, that there was a level of human association beneath which doctrinal distinctions simply did not apply. This was, from the Church's perspective, not tolerance, it was indifferentism. And indifferentism was, in the theological vocabulary of the 18th century, a heresy. The most detailed papal condemnation came in 1884 when Pope Leo XIII issued Humanum Genus, a full encyclical devoted to the Masonic question, running to thousands of words, calling the fraternity the kingdom of Satan and alleging a coordinated campaign to dechristianize civilization. Leo was not a foolish man. He was, by the standards of 19th century papal writing, a sophisticated one. But Humanum Genus reflected a century of accumulated Catholic anti-Masonic literature that had grown, with each passing decade, more detached from what the lodges actually contained and more dependent on what its critics imagined they must contain. The Catholic prohibition on Masonic membership was codified in Canon Law 2335 of the 1917 Code, which explicitly excommunicated Catholics who joined the fraternity. When the 1983 revision of Canon Law dropped the explicit canon, some Catholics concluded that the prohibition had been quietly lifted. It had not. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, headed at the time by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, issued a declaration in November 1983 stating that Catholics who joined Masonic associations were in grave sin and could not receive Holy Communion. The declaration has never been rescinded. A Catholic who becomes a Freemason today is still, by the official teaching of his church, in mortal peril. The irony that this persistent and ferocious institutional opposition constitutes the strongest available evidence against the theory that Masons secretly run the Catholic Church has not, historically, prevented the theory from flourishing. Benito Mussolini banned Masonry in Italy in 1925, within months of consolidating his dictatorship. Masonic lodges were raided. Members were publicly identified. Some were beaten. Some were killed. Francisco Franco banned the fraternity in Spain in 1940 by decree, classifying Masonic activity as a criminal offense. The Soviet Union suppressed Masonry as a bourgeois institution incompatible with the materialist state. Saudi Arabia and Iran banned it as incompatible with Islamic law. None of this deterred the most devastating persecution of all, which began in Germany in 1933. The Nazi state did not merely ban Freemasonry, it theorized it. Himmler's SS produced exhibitions, films, and academic-seeming treatises presenting Masonry as a Jewish instrument for the subversion of the German nation, a front organization for the same conspiratorial power that the protocols of the Elders of Zion had allegedly exposed. Masonic lodges were closed, their records seized, their libraries plundered. Members were arrested. Those who could not prove prior resignation from the fraternity were classified as enemies of the state, and in the camps, they wore an inverted blue triangle, a badge distinct from the yellow Star of David, worn by Jewish prisoners, marking them as a separate category of enemy. Holocaust historians and Masonic archival research estimate that tens of thousands to as many as 200,000 Freemasons died in Nazi concentration camps across occupied Europe, a figure that varies significantly depending on methodology, and which should be understood as an estimate rather than a count, but which represents by any measure one of the bloodiest episodes in the fraternity's history. The Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory that underpinned this persecution, the claim that Jews and Freemasons formed a coordinated secret cabal directing world events from the shadows, did not originate with the Nazis. It had been built, brick by poisoned brick, over more than a century of accumulated forgery and fabrication, and its principal architect was not a Nazi ideologue, but a French journalist with a taste for elaborate practical jokes. This is the part the popular story most consistently gets wrong. Leo Taxil, born Gabriel Antoine Jogan Paget in Marseille in 1854, had spent the early part of his career as a virulent anti-clerical pamphleteer, producing mock ecclesiastical literature and obscene anti-Catholic satires that earned him a modest notoriety and several legal proceedings. In 1885, apparently having exhausted the entertainment value of attacking the church from the left, he performed one of the more extraordinary pivots in the history of journalism. He announced his conversion to Catholicism, was received into the church with considerable publicity, and immediately began producing a new series of publications, this time purporting to expose the satanic secrets of Freemasonry. What followed was 12 years of the most successful hoax in the history of religious publishing. Taxil invented an entirely fictional inner order of Masonry called Palladism, complete with Luciferian rituals, satanic invocations, and a hierarchical structure of initiates devoted to the literal worship of the devil. He invented a fictional woman named Diana Vaughan, a high-ranking Masonic priestess and devil worshipper who had experienced a miraculous conversion to Catholicism and whose confessions Taxil published in installments over the course of several years, complete with her supposed accounts of satanic ceremonies, conversations with demons, and the inner workings of the hidden Masonic Luciferian conspiracy. Catholic newspapers across Europe and America published and amplified these revelations. Several bishops endorsed them. One was sent to the Vatican. Pope Leo XIII, who had just finished writing Humanum Genus, and was in no state of mind to be skeptical of Masonic exposés, received Taxil in private audience in 1887 and offered him an apostolic blessing. Taxil understood that the market for Masonic conspiracy was essentially unlimited, and he supplied it with the systematic productivity of a professional writer who knew exactly what his audience wanted to read. On the 19th of April, 1897, Taxil called a press conference at the Grand Orient of Paris and told the assembled journalists, Catholic clergymen, and journalists that he had something to confess. Every word of it, he said, had been invented. Diana Vaughan did not exist. Palladism did not exist. The satanic rites, the Luciferian priestesses, the inner circle of devil-worshipping Masons, none of it had ever happened outside his own imagination. He had maintained the fiction for 12 years with the deliberate intention of demonstrating that the Catholic press would believe any anti-Masonic sensationalism without evidence, and his demonstration had proved entirely successful. He was sorry for any inconvenience. The audience, according to contemporary accounts, reacted with fury. Taxil was 43 years old when he made this confession. He died in 1907 without ever fully explaining his actual motivations, which remain a matter of some historical debate. What is not debatable is his legacy. The specific fabrications he introduced, the claim that Masonry contained a hidden Luciferian inner order, the claim that Albert Pike had proclaimed Lucifer the god of the higher degrees, the claim that the fraternity's true purpose was satanic worship, survived his confession by more than a century. They circulate today, on websites and in books and in the commentary sections of YouTube videos, attributed to sources that themselves trace back through a chain of unchecked citations to the admitted fiction of a French journalist who confessed to inventing them in 1897. Albert Pike deserves a moment of his own because what has been done to him illustrates the mechanism precisely. Pike was born in Boston in 1809 and died in Washington, D.C. in 1891. He was a Confederate general during the Civil War, a fact that is true and worth stating plainly, and his post-war life was dominated by his work in the Scottish Rite, whose southern jurisdiction he served as supreme commander for 32 years, from 1859 until his death. He was an extraordinarily prolific writer of Masonic philosophy, and his principal work, Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, published in 1871, runs to nearly 900 pages of dense philosophical prose drawing on comparative mythology, Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalah, and the history of esoteric traditions worldwide. It is a serious book, even when it is wrong, and it has been consistently stripped of context by people who are looking for a single quotable sentence. The sentence they usually find appears on page 321. Pike is discussing the etymology of the word Lucifer, from the Latin lux, light, and ferere, to carry. The light bearer, the morning star, Venus rising before the sun. Lucifer, he writes, the light bearer. Strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning. Is it he who bears the light, and with its splendors, intolerable, blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? Pike was making a point about the paradox of light, that what illuminates can also blind, that the bearer of light might be mistaken for its enemy. He was not, in any reading of the surrounding text, endorsing devil worship or describing Masonic ritual. Taxiel took this passage, stripped it of context, placed it within the fabricated framework of palladism, and used it as his central proof that the highest Masonic initiates worshipped Lucifer. The proof outlived the confession. Then there is the letter. A document circulates in conspiracy literature. It has done so since the 1920s, purporting to be a letter from Albert Pike to Giuseppe Mazzini, the Italian nationalist revolutionary, written in 1871, in which Pike allegedly outlines a plan for 3 world wars, including the final conflict between Christianity and Islam that would allow the hidden Masonic power to install a Luciferian world government. The letter is specific. It is detailed. It mentions Nazism, a term that did not exist in 1871. No original document has ever been produced. The British Library, long falsely claimed as holding the original, has stated plainly and repeatedly that no such letter exists in their collection. Pike died in 1891. Mazzini died in 1872. No contemporary reference to any such correspondence appears in the extensive surviving papers of either man. The text first appeared in print in the 1920s, in works that drew heavily on Taxiel's discredited fabrications. It is a forgery. The evidence for this conclusion is unambiguous. The letter has no original, no contemporary witness, and internal anachronisms that date it to the 20th century. State that plainly, and move on. What the allegations against Freemasonry, the Satanism, the world domination, the Judeo-Masonic cabal actually reveal is not a conspiracy, but a pattern. The same anxieties, the same fabrications, the same misquoted passages circulating through the same unchecked chains of citation for more than a century, each new generation discovering them as if for the first time, each generation convinced that this time the evidence is too detailed to have been invented. And yet when you examine what the lodges actually contain, the documented ritual, the published philosophy, the recorded history, you find something considerably more modest and considerably more human. You find a fraternity that offered its members a space for reflection on virtue and mortality, a network of mutual assistance that was real and sometimes abused, a charitable impulse that built children's hospitals and retirement homes, and a persistent gap between its professed ideals and its actual practices that it spent 2 centuries slowly, imperfectly, and incompletely trying to close. Some of the allegations contain truth. The Masonic networks were real, and at certain moments in certain places, they were used for purposes that had nothing to do with virtue or brotherhood. The P2 affair and the scandal that broke in Italy in 1981 is the clearest case, and it is essential precisely because it is real. Propaganda due. P2 began as a regular lodge of the Grand Orient of Italy and became something else entirely under the control of a man named Licio Gelli, a former fascist sympathizer, textile merchant, and extraordinarily well-connected fixer who had spent decades cultivating relationships with politicians, military officers, intelligence officials, and financiers across the Italian state. By the time a police raid in March 1981 uncovered Gelli's membership list at his villa in Arezzo, P2 had been operating for years as a clandestine organization that bore almost no resemblance to the fraternal charity masonry presented to the public. The list contained 962 names. Among them were cabinet ministers, members of parliament, military generals, judges, intelligence chiefs, the heads of all 3 Italian security services, the chief of the national police, journalists, bankers, and Silvio Berlusconi, then a property developer and media entrepreneur, not yet a prime minister. The lodge had been operating without the knowledge or authorization of the Grand Orient of Italy, which had suspended it in 1976 for irregular activity. P2 was not, in any formal Masonic sense, a legitimate lodge. It was a clandestine network that used Masonic structure, the obligations, the oaths of secrecy, the hierarchical trust, as the skeleton for something that the Masonic tradition would not recognize and explicitly did not authorize. This distinction matters enormously. P2 is the case that conspiracy theorists most often cite as proof that Masonry secretly runs governments, and it is simultaneously the case that most clearly demonstrates why the conspiracy theory is wrong about what Masonic power actually looks like. Masonic power, where it has existed and been abused, has looked like P2, a network of men using fraternal bonds to protect each other from accountability, to share information that gave them advantages over outsiders, to operate as a faction within institutions rather than as a controlling force above them. It looked like corruption. It looked like what corruption always looks like: personal, opportunistic, human in its motives and its failures. It did not look like a secret world government. Roberto Calvi, the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano and a P2 member, was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London in June 1982, his pockets filled with bricks and cash. Whether it was suicide or murder remained officially unresolved for years. Italian courts eventually concluded it was murder. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, which was entangled with Vatican finances in ways that a full parliamentary investigation struggled to fully untangle, cost creditors hundreds of millions of dollars. The P2 scandal brought down the Italian government of Prime Minister Arnaldo Forlani. It produced parliamentary commissions and criminal trials and a formal ban on secret associations in Italian law. It was a genuine scandal. The men involved were genuinely powerful. The use of Masonic structures to facilitate their network was real. And the Grand Orient of Italy, whose lodge it had fraudulently been, expelled Gelli and condemned the organization in terms that left no ambiguity. The conspiracy theorist looks at P2 and sees confirmation. The Masons were behind everything. The historian looks at P2 and sees something else. A clandestine organization operating in explicit violation of the rules of its host institution, exposed by a police raid, condemned by mainstream Masonry, prosecuted by the Italian state, and shut down. The Masonic connection gave P2 its organizational skeleton. It did not give it impunity. The men involved went to trial. That is what real Masonic corruption looks like. It looks nothing like the theory. By the time the P2 scandal broke, Freemasonry in the Western world had already entered a long, quiet decline that no conspiracy, domestic or international, was doing anything to reverse. The peak of American Masonic membership was reached in 1959, when approximately 4.1 million men were active lodge members across the United States, a number that represented something like 1 in every 6 American adult males. The lodge was, in post-war America, a fixture of middle-class civic life. The Elks, the Lions, the Knights of Columbus, and the Freemasons formed the fraternal infrastructure of a society that organized itself through voluntary associations in ways that later decades would find increasingly unfamiliar. The lodge was where a man established his reputation in a new town, where he found the doctor or the lawyer or the employer who could help him, where he sat on the level with men of different occupations and different backgrounds, and was reminded once a month or once a week that the obligations of brotherhood extended beyond the boundaries of his immediate family. By the early 1960s, the peak had passed, and the decline that followed was slow enough to be deniable for a generation, and then sudden enough to be alarming. By 2000, American membership had fallen to approximately 2 million. By the mid-2020s, estimates place it between 1 and 1.2 million, a fall of roughly 70% from the post-war peak, distributed across 3 generations of diminishing interest. England followed a parallel trajectory. A peak of approximately 500,000 in the 1960s has contracted by more than half. The causes are not mysterious, and they are not the result of suppression. The fraternal organization model that sustained Masonry for 2 centuries depended on a social architecture that has been substantially dismantled by the same forces that dismantled every equivalent institution. The rise of professional networks that made personal patronage less necessary, the secularization of public life that made the religious underpinning of lodge ceremony less resonant, the proliferation of leisure options that competed for the evenings that lodge meetings had once filled, and, perhaps most significantly, the gradual opening of institutions that had once been closed, which reduced the value of private alternatives. A society in which a Jewish man could join the same country club as his Protestant neighbor had less need for the lodge as the neutral ground where men of different faiths could meet on equal terms. The very progress that Masonry had, in some small way, helped to make possible had made Masonry less necessary. What remained was different in character from what had existed at the peak. The Shriners Hospitals for Children, 22 hospitals across North America, treating pediatric orthopedic conditions, burns, cleft lip and palate, and spinal cord injuries, at no cost to the families of their patients, represent the most visible and verifiable institutional achievement of the American Masonic tradition in its late period. The Shriners International, formerly the ancient Arabic Order of the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, was founded in 1870 in New York by a physician named Walter Fleming and an entertainer named William Florence, and its elaborate adoption of Islamic and Arabic aesthetic, the red fez, the scimitar, the crescent, the ceremonial pageantry, was from the beginning costume theater rather than religious content, a deliberate theatricality intended to distinguish the appendant body from the more solemn ceremonies of the craft degrees. What the Shriners built with that theatrical energy was a hospital network that has treated millions of children since its founding in 1922, with an annual operating budget measured in billions of dollars, funded by a membership whose numbers have declined, but whose commitment to the charitable mission has not. This is what 300 years of fraternal organization produced at its most concrete. A children's hospital where a family in crisis is told that the cost is not theirs to bear, that the Brotherhood has already paid it, that whatever happens in this building happens because a group of men in red hats decided a century ago that this was worth doing. It is a strange lineage from the Goose and Gridiron, and yet the line runs straight. In the years since the peak, some Grand Lodges have responded to membership decline by reducing the secrecy that was always, in any case, more symbolic than functional. UGLE and many American Grand Lodges now maintain websites, publish material explaining the degrees, hold open days at lodge buildings, and actively encourage members to identify themselves as Masons in public life. The hiding in plain sight has, in some jurisdictions, become something closer to simply standing in the open. The United Grand Lodge of England still meets at Freemasons Hall on Great Queen Street in Holborn, a building constructed as a memorial to the Masons who died in the First World War, completed in 1933, seating nearly 1,700 in its grand temple and open to anyone who wishes to walk through the doors and take the tour. The Order of Women Freemasons, founded in Britain in 1908, and Le Droit Humain, the mixed Masonic order founded in France in 1893, have both continued to grow quietly in the decades when regular Masonry has declined. Neither holds recognition from UGLE or regular Masonic bodies worldwide. Both work the same: 3 craft degrees, the same hierarchic legend, the same symbolic language of the square and the compasses, and both have concluded that the fraternal tradition they inherited is worth preserving and extending, regardless of whether the men who built that tradition choose to recognize them for doing so. The question of who is welcome and on what terms and who decides? It was the question Prince Hall asked of Boston's lodges in 1775, and it was the question his successors were still asking of American Grand Lodges 200 years later, and it is the question that women's Masonry has been asking since 1893, and it does not yet have a final answer. The temple, as always, is unfinished. On the 24th of June, 1717, 4 groups of men arrived at a tavern above a London courtyard and voted to form an organization that would, within a generation, attract the patronage of kings and the enmity of popes, cross the Atlantic on the ships of revolutionaries, survive bans and persecutions and the deliberate fabrications of a French journalist who confessed the whole scheme to a furious press conference in 1897, and ultimately outlive every government that tried to suppress it. Anthony Sayer, the first Grand Master, died in poverty, receiving charity from his own lodge. The symbols he wore, the square, the compasses, the apron of white lambskin, ended up on courthouses and cornerstones and the currency of nations. The secret he was charged to keep has been public knowledge since 1730. What the Freemasons actually are, behind the mythology and the forgeries and the 3 centuries of projection, is something more difficult to categorize and more resistant to summary than either their admirers or their enemies have ever been willing to admit. They are a fraternity that told itself it was preserving ancient wisdom and was probably preserving something older and stranger than wisdom, a need persistent across every human culture in every era for a ritual space in which ordinary men could briefly become something more than ordinary, bound by obligations they chose freely, equal for an hour to men they would never meet as equals outside the door. They are a network that was real enough to be abused, and human enough to abuse itself, and honest enough, eventually imperfectly too slowly, to acknowledge the gap between its professed ideals and its actual history. They are an institution that looked at the symbols on your money and your courthouse and your city's skyline and told you those symbols meant something that you did not yet know how to read. They were not entirely wrong. If hidden histories like this one are what you're looking for, subscribe. There's a new one every week.